Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tino Cuellar. I have the privilege of being the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. As I was walking over here with Darshana, I was thinking about how perhaps the greatest privilege in this job is when I know we are doing something that the world needs doing, but that nobody else is doing. Today, it is my great privilege, in partnership with our friends from the New Zealand Embassy and the Australian Embassy, and with our friends from island communities all over the Pacific, to come together for one purpose, and it is a purpose that is at the heart of what we do at the Carnegie Endowment. And that is to help the world better understand how the world looks from the perspective of our island nation partners and friends who are frontline facing the crisis of climate that the world is struggling with in every corner of the world, in deserts, in cities, in mountains, in valleys, but particularly in island communities. And I want to highlight to you that we were created as an organization 113 years ago, when I was not born. And at that time, there was a mix of idealism in the world reflected in our founder, Andrew Carnegie. I just learned today that, in fact, in addition to doing many other things, he built libraries, including in some of your countries, years ago. His two passions: libraries, because they reflected the idea that human wisdom and knowledge would bridge divides and gaps, but also global peace and cooperation. He had come to the United States as a poor immigrant from Scotland with no more than $5 in his pocket, and had managed to become the richest person in the world. That money burned a hole in his pocket. He was frustrated with that money. He wanted that money to act and do something constructive. And the passion he had for peace led him to create our organization. He had an idea that was now something that sounds very naive. It was the idea that if you use knowledge, relationships, analysis, conversation, and you learn how to listen to people from different cultures, you can solve almost every problem that the world faces. He was right in those ideals. He was wrong to think that in 20 years those ideals would abolish war. That's what he thought at the time. No, didn't happen. But he is right in recognizing that the whole set of tools that he gave us are absolutely central to the challenges that your countries, your island nations, face to this day. And I want to highlight how we consider that to be so urgent and important right now. Fisheries production. So much of the world feeds itself from fish. I know that in some of the countries represented here, Vanuatu, fishing production has gone down about 75% since 1990. Think about what that means for livelihoods, for nutrition. Second, sea level rise, the most direct, most concrete manifestation of the climate. I am from California, a place where the intersection between the environment and policy is constantly on our minds, whether it's wildfires or the coastline. But as I think of what it means to be in an island community close to sea level, every single year knowing that in the Pacific, the sea is going up 0.3 meters, that is a national security issue. It's a life or death issue. Finally, I think about the extreme weather events that have been such a burden for some of us in California, but in many of your countries are affecting security, health, economic productivity, and I know the world has unfinished business. This event is not going to solve every problem. I recognize that. But as I thought about why it becomes so important to us, it's because we want to take a look at these issues not from the perspective of Washington or California or New York, where so many of you have worked, but from the perspective of the people in your countries, the policymakers who have to deal with this day to day, the adaptation challenges, the resource challenges, and what countries like New Zealand, Australia, the United States, and others can do to be effective and thoughtful and respectful partners. So for all those reasons, I am troubled and concerned about the world, but it brings me joy to have you right here with us today. And I look forward to hearing about all the productive ideas and perspectives that you hatch together. And I am happy to turn it over to Darshana now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tino. If I may request our speakers, ambassadors, Jane, Ambassador Tony, Ambassador Marco, and Ambassador Lutero, to please join me on stage. Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the conversation on climate security, a specific view from the Pacific region. We're delighted and honored to be able to host dignitaries from the Pacific Island nations. And special thank you to our speakers today for taking this time to share your perspectives and views on the subject with those of us here in Washington, D.C. We're absolutely delighted to be joined on stage with ambassadors from Solomon Islands, Tonga, Nauru, and Samoa to share some of the regional perspectives as well as the conversations at the UN where you're from New York, where you are based. I also want to take a moment to thank and recognize our partners and friends at the Embassy of Australia and New Zealand in Washington, D.C. for this conversation this afternoon. I also want to thank and acknowledge ambassadors from Kiribati, Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Palau, PNG, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu in the audience. Thank you, ambassadors, for your time this afternoon. I just want to take 2 minutes to provide some framing around the conversation today before I turn to our speakers to provide for their opening remarks. The topic for today's conversation is deliberate and intentional emphasis on the fact that the conversation between climate change and national security are not two separate ones, but one which is interconnected. To a great extent, at times, that conversation is one and the same. Many of us here in Washington, D.C., who work on geopolitics and do research on regional conversations and politics often hear of climate change as a non-traditional security issue or a conversation that is separate from the issue of national security. We could not have asked for better insight into this dichotomy between climate change and national security than our esteemed speakers today. As someone who's part of this community, part of the think tank and research community based in Washington, D.C., I think there is a need, and more so an urgency, to understand this difference, or rather the correlation between the two, if we want to seriously understand the issues of importance and priorities in the Pacific. With that, I will now turn to our speakers to offer their opening remarks on the subject. I'll then moderate a conversation before opening the floor for a conversation with our guest. Ambassador Otero, if I may turn to you first to provide your views and perspectives on the subject and what it might mean specifically for Samoa, but perhaps also as the chair for AOSIS, you might have views at a multilateral level. Over to you. Yes.
Thank you very much, moderator. All protocol observed. Let me perhaps start by giving a perspective from a small island development state. I'm also the chair of the Alliance of Small Island States based in New York. I think the orthodox, as has been mentioned, definition of the achievement of peace and security is associated with the absence of conflict, violent conflict. But this sort of definition is not associated with how we define it in the Pacific. It does not fit. Our perspective does not fit the conventional definition. So the question is, what exactly is the role of climate in the issue of security? For the Pacific, climate change impacts will bring instability, security risk, and conflict of a different nature. For example, in our region, we had a number of decoration by our head of states. And some of these, the most recent one is the Poet Decoration. And again, it sets out what we see as security risk in our region. And these are broadly covered under definitions such as the environment, resource security, transnational crime, and cybersecurity. But perhaps one of the things that I want to sort of touch on very, very briefly is the issue of climate change, the issue of sea level rise, because these are the critical issues that impact our small island developing states. Climate change is something that I think is impacting all of us to a varying degrees. But for us, the 1.5 degrees Celsius is a red line that we cannot afford to go under. It is also about survival, and it's about ambition. The impact of climate change and the issue of climate justice are also important considerations. Vanuatu has recently, through the International Court of Justice, have asked for an advisory opinion on the issue of climate justice. And this is outside the normal UN framework or mechanism, the UNFCCC. And this highlights the importance of issues like this to small island states. And when we cannot wait another 30 years, for example, to have these issues addressed, we have to find other alternative ways of addressing the issues that are important to us. Perhaps before I conclude, let me also touch on another issue, which is very important in addressing the issue of climate change in small island development states. And that is the issue, I'm not sure whether you've heard of it, but it's the Multi-Dimensional Vulnerability Index. For a long time, the GDP has been used as the metric for assessing development assistance to developing countries. But small island states have been saying for a long time that metrics, the GDP, we need to go beyond GDP because it does not accurately assess our vulnerability. Our vulnerability in terms of economic shocks, our vulnerability in terms of environmental shock, our vulnerability in terms of social shock. And I think you can relate some of this to recent events, the pandemic, for example, the impact of the Ukraine war, for example, and of course climate change as it relates to the environment. So the MVI is something that we've been advocating for the last 30 years. And finally, we're able to get this through the United Nations General Assembly. And we're looking now at having it through the General Assembly for endorsement and then implementation by the various international financial institutions, multilateral development banks, etc. And you might ask, well, what will this do then in terms of small island developing states? Well, I'll just list three and then I'll finish. The first issue is our access to concessional finance. This is very important in terms of our ability to address the impact and effects of climate change. And just to give you an example, a developing country at this point in time attracts 5 to 8% if you want to take out a loan, whereas a developed country is levied 1%. So all we're asking is a level playing field in terms of access to concessional financing. We're not asking for free money. We're just asking for level playing fields. The second one relates to debt. As you know, the COVID has impacted a lot of our countries. We depend on tourism. And during COVID, we prioritize the safety of our population and communities rather than economic consideration. But now the dilemma we find ourselves in is to make a choice between paying our debts or meet our obligations in terms of the sustainable development goals. 17 goals, because we have commitment and obligation. And then the third use that we hope the MVI will be used for is to improve the allocation of overseas development aid. At the moment, the only metrics used is your level of development, where you stand. And that determines your eligibility. Well, if you've got a country that is a middle-level income country, and a cyclone or tsunami hits that country, it will put back its development 10 to 20 years. It does not recognize the level of development. But these are small island developing states. So it's important that we use the DDP as well as the MVI. And then finally, for our own planning, I think the MVI in terms of national policy planning is going to be very useful because it directs government into focusing on those areas where improvement needs to be made, where resources need to be directed, and where capacity also is lacking and needs to be addressed. I'm sorry I've gone over my 5 minutes, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador Mando. Whichever.
So thank you. Let me thank the chair for giving us a framework so that I can speak, and thank you, Dashana, for inviting me to speak. I was about to say all protocols, but excellencies, colleagues, and friends. So let me start from another angle. So I was invited to speak on climate and security. So I'm also ambassador to the UN, based in New York. So there's an initiative that the ambassador, we co-chair a group of friends on climate and security, and it's between Nauru and Germany. And this is really the group, there's 65 members right now, member states who joined this group, and this group was formed in 2018. So to give you another initiative that's going on in the United Nations. And basically what this initiative was created really is a premise of the Pacific Small Island Developing States recognizing that climate change is an existential threat to our nations, but there was not much activity being done or not much response from the United Nations itself as a global institution for international peace and security level, and also the development part that just does not come, which my colleague alluded to in terms of the UNFCCC discussions and debate. So coming from that angle, the Pacific already knew that climate change was coming, but is now a lived reality. So it's no longer coming, we're living with it. And we're trying to adapt as best as we can. And the institution that we pay to be able to respond to our needs is the United Nations in terms of international peace and security. However, it falls short of addressing the needs of these small countries because we're not a conflict area country. So the focus has always been in Africa. So we get missed, or how they say it in SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, left behind. So these are some of the elements where this group formulated and has 65 members, and the US is also a member. I believe there was a climate summit that Biden hosted and raised the profile of climate and security as an international peace and security issue that can have impacts upon the globe. And so one of the elements that we do as a group of friends, we try to advocate, promote awareness, raise the ambition of the UN to be responsive. And some of those issues, and this is the Pacific Islands Forum initiative, is to call for a special representative to come to inform us, well, under the Security Secretary General of the UN, to actually inform us where these, like, it's like an early warning system. Like, tell us what's going to happen, what's the impact of climate on our countries, other than just sea level rise. We have disasters, frequent droughts, frequent intensities of weathers. These are the kind of responses that we need according to the UN, because they have to be evidence-based to be able to deploy and do their work. But as I said, this is in advocacy mode. We always promote some of this, but because the UN, the Security Council, does not accept that climate is an issue for discussion. Actually, there are some of us who suggest that climate is a development issue, but we're kind of beyond that if you look around the world. So this is one of the things that I wanted to raise. And in terms of the Pacific itself and Nauru, we've raised this as a national security issue and something that needs leverage and actually needs support from the US. Not only your actions in terms of mitigation, but also your actions in financing and helping us to adapt to the new world that we're experiencing, because it's no longer coming, it is actually a reality. So I think there's not much in terms of, did I cover my 5 minutes? I think I've covered my couple of minutes. Happy to take questions, and thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador Tony, if I may invite you to please offer your remarks. I think it's on, Ambassador. I think it's on.
Well, thank you, Dashana, and also acknowledge the wonderful and very insightful opening remarks by the president of Carnegie and Foundation. And of course, thank you, Dashana, for moderating our session. Of course, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we are very honored to be here. Let me just start by contextualizing our session. Of course, we were here at the facilitation by the New Zealand Embassies and the Australian Embassy for us to be here in Washington and to interact with the US at different tables. And of course, we are very fortunate to interact with them. And climate change and climate and security, in relation to security, was one of the issues that we discussed with the US. Coming back to your question, Dashana, in the perspective of Tonga, there is a direct correlation between climate change and security. And as alluded to by the chair of AOSIS, you heard him referring to the Boe Declaration, which is a regional security declaration of the Pacific Island Forum. In addition to that, of course, we have the maybe two other documents I want to refer to: the 2050 Pacific Strategy for Blue Pacific continent, going for the next 30 years. And also we have the regional document of the declaration by the Pacific leaders in 2021 about the maintaining of the maritime zones in the face of climate change-related sea level rise. In those documents, the Pacific leaders and the Pacific have enhanced the concept of climate change a security issue, even to the extent of declaring that it is the single most existential threat for the Pacific. So that is a very hardline sentence and clause to be included in those documents. So to answer your question and concern, Darshana, we have documents at the regional level that attaches climate change to security. Of course, when you look at the national levels, we have our own stories of sea level rise, and we have countries like even Tonga, but of course, notably Tuvalu, Marshall Islands, and Kiribati. They have strong indications of impact of sea level rise, not to mention, of course, impacts on food security, biodiversity, land, water, even territorial integrity of our island nations. So to us, we have strong evidence, and of course, science to back up our claim and our advocacy. And of course, the latest report by the IPCC, even in the case of Tonga, has listed, the reports of the most at-risk country have listed Tonga as the third most at-risk country in the world. I think Vanuatu has been consistent at number 1, but Tonga could be at number 3 or 2, possibly 4, but at least it's a very at the top rank of that index. Again, from a country example, there is evidence of Tonga being impacted negatively by climate change to the extent of impacting the different levels of society, even the mental health and the health of the population. When you look at the cost, of course, we experience regular cyclones in our country. For example, in 2018, we received Cyclone Gisa and Cyclone Harold in 2020. By average, between those two cyclones, it costed Tonga about 32% of its GDP. The volcanic eruption that occurred in Tonga in 2022 last year, even though it's not related to climate change, but nevertheless, from the perspective of disasters, it costed our GDP about 36%. So in terms of cost, it is very costly. And as I mentioned before, in terms of the livelihoods of people, it is affected. So fisheries are affected because of ocean acidification, affecting our fisheries, our biodiversities, our marine biodiversity. So there are many things that are affected by the adverse impacts of climate change. Hence, Darshana, there is a direct correlation between the adverse impact of climate change and security. So let me just stop there and would be happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And Ambassador Jane, if I may turn to you now for a Solomon Islands perspective, please.
Thank you, Darshana, colleague excellencies, and ladies and gentlemen.
Do you mind turning the mic?
Thank you. I'd like to thank the Chair of ASIS, colleague Ambassador, for setting the scene, the regional scene for PCH, especially in terms of this subject. I'll be speaking to the context of Solomon Islands in terms of the impacts of climate change. I think other colleagues have already mentioned that climate change remains the single greatest threat to all the Pacific Island countries, and Solomon Islands is no exception as well. Perhaps I would like to share some specific experiences from Solomon Islands, especially in terms of the impact of sea level rise for Solomon Islands. Solomon Islands is sort of like represent as one of the bigger countries, but in terms of the context, we do have atolls, some low-lying islands, and of course, big islands as well, represented by the 6 major provinces. And very obviously, with the increasing sea level rise, that has a great impact in terms of the livelihoods of those fellow citizens who are actually residing on the atolls and the low-lying areas. And in terms of their livelihoods, the intrusion of salt water into their livelihoods, their gardenings. So it does have impact in terms of the food security as well. In addition to that as well, Solomon Islands being an island nation, the connectivity in terms of infrastructure, the impact of climate change, especially the sea level rise, has contributed to the erosion of road networks around the islands. And these are including infrastructure such as wharves and including schools, health and education infrastructures as well, which are located close to the coastal areas. And these are very expensive in nature, let alone the maintenance or the upkeep of such infrastructures as well. The other added area as well in terms of the impact is it contributes to relocation of those who have been affected in those respective islands. And it involves not only, it's not only the relocation, but it involves cost when you're relocating a community. It involves, it's a costly undertaking. And not only that, but on the, in terms of resettling, given the differences in terms of their culture, how do you reintegrate them into a new setting with a very different background, for example, with our Polynesian and Micronesian fellow countrymen. Relocating them in a Melanesian context is not that straightforward as one would think. It involves a lot of negotiation, it involves a lot of acceptance, and this could be, like potential triggers for conflict if it's not managed well, if it's not implemented properly. So this could give rise to potential conflicts in situations, especially when it gives rise to the urban drift of youth, for example, when there are no other options and it's challenging, they drift into the urban areas like the only city in Solomon Islands, which is Honiara, and they'll be exposed to challenges, especially in terms of some activities that are unwelcome activities that affects them. So these are some of the experiences that we face from Solomon Islands context in terms of the impact of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, all of you, for providing your opening remarks, but also giving very specific examples and helping us understand, I think, some of the finer details of the climate conversation. Ambassador Margot, actually, if I can start with you, with because you placed it within the UN system also, that something is not working. It's in terms of the nexus between climate and security, and because there seems to be some sort of there's a tendency within the UN system to place more focus on issues or areas which are considered traditional conflict zones or traditional security issues. But there has been calls for, reformation of the UNSC as well. But I was wondering if you wanted to sort of tease that out a little bit more, that it's not working because it's also a system that was created decades ago at a time when climate was not as front and center as we are feeling it today. So how would you say that conversation is playing out at the UN, or do you think there is a need for maybe revisions or rethinking of the way the norms and procedures are set up at the UN to deal with impact of climate change?
Thank you, Darshana. That's a loaded question. In terms of the United Nations Security Council, there is a reform going on in terms of if all understand, the permanent 5 that sit on the seats in the council, and they are actually the permanent 5 that have the veto vote, which when a resolution is not agreed, they will vote against and nothing goes through. So that discussion is an ongoing discussion that the UN, the United Nations, that was formed how many years ago? I can't even remember. We had a 75th, probably 78th, 77 years ago, out of World War II, is no longer fit for the purpose that is required to accommodate all the United Nations 193 members today. And all the issues, and you rightfully said, I mean, if anyone hears the Secretary General calling out, we're in a climate emergency. But the response at the top level of that machinery of the United Nations, which is the Security Council, is not working. So there's one reform, and then there's another that does not address the real issues for today, or the emerging, well, I didn't say emerging, but those issues that keep the global world supposedly in international order, so, and peace and security. So one of the it's Such a loaded question. So I'm trying to distill some of the elements. So one of the things that the group of friends has actually done, and this is when a member becomes a member of the group, becomes a member of the Security Council, especially the non-permanent members, we ask them to advocate and have debates to raise the issues so that this discussion about climate and its implications to international peace and security is really leveraged at that level. And one of the examples that was clearly seen that it was between a resolution, UN resolution, Ireland and Niger put forward at the Security Council, and which Russia vetoed. It's the climate and security element to put the climate on the agenda of the top UN Security Council. So they vetoed it, so that 113 co-sponsored that resolution, and so nothing happened in terms of addressing the climate and security. So the United Nations itself is stuck. And in that sense, the debate has to still continue, the advocacy has still to continue, but it's a real issue. So I'm gonna leave it at that, so hopefully.
If any of our other ambassadors, also if you have any thoughts that you wanted to provide on that, since you're all at the UN and in New York, if you had any additional thoughts, please feel free to.
Can I say that the Security Council is the only institution in the UN system that has any real authority. But the difficulty is, as Margot was saying, we have 5 permanent members, and any one of them can veto, which means nothing happens. So you will have a situation where the organization will be paralyzed. One country out of 193. And one of the things that is being considered at the moment, because it's extremely difficult to predict whether there will be some changes at the Security Council because of the veto of the 5 permanent members. But I think the other options that could be entertained is to look at setting up a similar council that deals with non-military issues, because then issues like climate change can be entertained. Issues such as development, for example, can be entertained, because at the end of the day, I think what is most important for us small islands development states is action and urgency. You cannot have a situation where issues that we put up, for example, takes over 30 years before we get any response. So I think this is why, as I mentioned earlier on as well, Vanuatu has taken the issue of climate justice, human rights to the International Court of Justice, not through the UNFCCC, because it will take a long time before we get any response. So perhaps those are some of the things that could be entertained and could be looked at. I don't know what some of you can do to move those along, but I think it's time to look at reforming the UN system. Thank you.
Thank you, Tashana. Maybe just very shortly, I think the bulk of the explanation have been given by my 2 colleagues. But these are some of the realities that we see in the world. But I guess we have to think positively about how to progress things, even if it is incremental. And I think there is one effort that I think may be categorized as trying to be incremental, make some progress nevertheless, is the attempt by many member states to appoint a special representative or a special envoy of the Secretary General for Security Council regarding climate change as a security issue. So I guess that hasn't been approved yet, but it's been on the table for quite some time now. Again, it's a slow train. But I can see that if it is going to be approved, we have already a number of special representatives and envoys of the Secretary General. Again, talking about the genre of make some progress nevertheless, despite things that can stall for years, we can at least attempt to at least achieve some low-hanging fruits. Just to add to that, to get some optimism in that direction. Thank you.
Just very briefly to add to, I think colleagues have covered that already, and I think the importance of keeping the momentum going, and of course representing SIDS, small island countries, in that August forum is very important in taking on board the need of the SID countries. Thank you.
Thank you, ambassadors. I think we have about 15 minutes for this conversation, and I'll invite our guest on the floor for any questions that you might have for our panel here. It's not often that we have ambassadors from the Pacific sitting with us in DC, so it's a great opportunity. And please raise your hands if you have a question and identify yourself briefly. And the microphone here, sir, and then Alina.
Hi,
And
Tamara.
if your question is directed at a particular speaker or to the panel in general.
Sure. Tamara Hemphill at CNA. This question is really probably for all of you, but particularly from the ambassador from Nauru. Simple question, but when these vetoes are happening on the Security Council, number one, what is the justification being given? And number two, is Russia the only country that is vetoing putting climate change at the top of the agenda, or are there others?
Is it okay if we take one more round of questions? I think Alina.
Thank you, ambassadors. Elena Noor from Carnegie. I admire your even-temperedness, given the crisis that is facing your countries. And I was particularly struck, Ambassador Lucero, by your remarks about the MVI and perhaps a rethink that's needed about the concept of GDP as a metric for development. And I was wondering, question for all the ambassadors, as you think fit. What does the notion of a developed country or a developed Pacific Islands region look like for you now in the wake of a climate crisis, bearing in mind that the traditional concept of GDP might not be the best measure of development?
Thank you. If I can turn to the panel, Ambassador Margot, you want to take that?
Let me quickly, and I think all my colleagues can answer that question. In terms of the 5 permanent members, they're the only ones with veto power. So in terms of so when Russia pulls it, the others don't need to pull it. And in terms of the group of friends on climate and security, so we have the United States, UK, and France are members. So we already knew that it would either be Russia or China. Those are the 5 permanent. And in the membership of the Security Council, there are others who don't believe that the Security Council is driven to address climate and security. So it's not just Russia, but Russia had the power and used that in that resolution, that moment, at that time. But there are other members who are non-permanent members at that time did not agree that climate change should be raised as an issue for the Security Council to discuss. As I said earlier, to them it's a development issue, and those states that are emitted a lot over time, the so-called Annex 1, should pay for the development, and those who... So there's that big argument of where it should lie, and Security Council was not one of them. So I hope to answer that because there are other questions. And I will come back, if I have time, to the MVI issues since it's directed.
Take that, please, if you want to.
Can I just add to that,
Yeah.
Kashana? I think the veto, I think it's something that has been around for long. And we can understand it. We can understand the history behind it and the reason why they have that privilege. But of course, you have to remember that we're countries, these are the countries that were victorious in World War II. And of course, we have to be thankful for them because there was a very terrible time for the world with Germany and its allies. But then, of course, one has to be mindful about the new members of the United Nations. There were many countries who were not nations at the time, but now they are countries. They have legitimate right in the United Nations for same voting power like the big countries. The other thing I want to relate to what my colleague from Samoa was saying, about reform. The concept of reform is trying to look for solutions given new surrounding. And the new surrounding with regards to accessibility to funds from international institutions, financial institutions, MDBs and IFIs, is because the GNI GDP is not helping the developing countries in view of the new surrounding of adverse impacts of climate change, something that was not existent in previous decades. Hence, there is logic, there is rationale into that argument. Hence, the drive to accept the MVI, we're trying to get it through the General Assembly, so that it gets tabled to the MDBs. To me personally, I see logic in that endeavor. I see logic in the claim by newly established states, sovereign states, independent states after World War II, that are now aspiring for progress, that the current setup is limiting the progress. To me, I see logic in that regard. The reason, and one of the reasons why we are trying to table climate change as a security issue to the Security Council, we understand it's a traditional conflict issue. The Security Council, of course, deals with traditional conflicts, the war, conflicts, things like that. But because we are not receiving the pledges, for example, the pledge of $100 billion per year by the developed countries to help the developing countries to address adaptation, it's a big ask. We have to find other means of trying to solve the problem. So that's part of the reason why we go to the Security Council, although traditionally it's a body that deals with traditional conflicts. Health, like all those health pandemics that are past, now the recent COVID-19, these are issues that can be related to security, but of a different dimension. But now we are looking into other ways to solve the problem. So I just want to add that part of the voice into your question, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador Chin, did you want to add?
Yeah, very, very briefly, I think colleagues have shared much of that as well, but I think it is very logical that, with the establishment of UN years ago, and development has evolved over time as well with changes that the challenges that we face, and I think there's that rationale in terms of adapting to the current situation as well. So it does give a rationale for the efforts and the ask of the seats. Thank you.
And if you can take the question on MPI and the GDP.
Thank you very much. I think the question is, what is our perception for the Pacific in terms of the future? I think I will use 3 words: peaceful, safe, and prosperous. That is the vision of our leaders in terms of the Pacific. In the context of the MVI, I think, let me be clear, the MVI is a tool. It's not a magic bullet that will solve all our problems in the Pacific, at least in the context of development. But I think it is a useful tool, a useful mechanism that will help us address the challenges that we face, whether these are in the economic domain, the environmental, or the social domain. And this is why, when you look at the way that we work, it's also important that we do not work in silos, because the crisis that we will face and continue to face in the future requires an interconnected approach, a multidimensional approach. And if you just take the COVID is one very good example to learn from. The WHO was given the role as the lead organization, but the response to COVID needs to go beyond WHO, because it wasn't just about expert medical knowledge. It was about logistics, it was about transportation, it was about manufacturing. So all these issues, and the WHO could not deal with all of those. So I think the lesson there, moving forward, and I will say the same for the MBI, when it is implemented, we need to ensure that we do not use the silo approach. And this is where all the agencies of the UN could also be utilized, but not only international organizations and agencies, but also well-organized regional entities in our own various regions, because they know the problem, they are on the ground basically, so to speak, and I think they'll be much more effective in terms of carrying out and ensuring that at the end of the day, communities on the ground are the people that we all want to see benefit from the work that we do. Thank you.
I think we have time for just one more round of short questions if anybody has questions. Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon. Lilia Bush with APCO Worldwide. My question is inspired by the comment from the ambassador to the Solomon Islands on the erosion of infrastructure and the impact of climate change on infrastructure. I was wondering whether any of your nations have seen a decline in FDI or a hesitancy on the part of foreign investors to invest in your states, and what the future of that looks like. Thank you.
And I saw one more hand. Yeah.
Hi, thank you, ambassadors. I'm Mary Wasser from Japan Bank for International Cooperation. Just a simple question. How do you assess the deliverables of the Quad Summit just held in Tokyo, and what can be done more to address the needs of Pacific Islands on the development side, in addition to level playing field for access to concessional finance? Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Jane, question to you on infrastructure and climate change, and then.
Yeah, thank you for that question. The impact on climate change for infrastructure in Solomon Islands, that is a very big issue or challenge, especially in terms of looking at when you're looking at the opportunities for investment, especially in the infrastructure. It becomes very, very expensive. And given the scattered nature of Solomon Islands, that in itself, it has its own challenges. Or if you're looking at transportation perspective in terms of the connectivity to the market, that also a very expensive undertaking. And for some islands, in terms of the reports, World Bank reports, it's one of the highest cost in terms of doing business. And I think that really translates into the challenges that we face during the impact of the COVID. Some islands were supposed to graduate from as an LDC, but that was not possible because of the challenges that was faced during, of course, the impact of the COVID in the recent years, but given the challenges that it continued to face as well, so it does not enable it to, and the fact that it's vulnerable to disasters as well, so the progress was not progressive, unfortunately. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And a question to the wider panel on the deliverables from Quad, if I heard that correctly, assessment of that happened in Tokyo, as well as I think on the concessional finance point that you raised, Ambassador Jarrah. Anyone on the panel wants to take the Quad question?
Maybe Australia.
So let me try to. I think it's too early to speak on the Quad. We recognize also the G7 and the side Quad. We also recognize the Secretary Blinken's visit and Prime Minister Modi's recent visit to the Pacific. So there's a lot of, to PNG more specifically, there's a lot of strategies called Indo-Pacific strategy also, the Quad. I think there's a lot of strategies out there, but I think the vision was clear in terms of the strategies that were put forward for free and open Indo-Pacific region. At this moment, these are some of the things that we're grappling with, because the US Pacific Summit also came out with the deliverables and commitments. So I'm just trying to, it's called a strategy, so a strategy might not really have deliverables at this moment, your question, just to be really specific to your question. But in terms of the strategy and plan to work together is there, it's reaffirmed in terms of the commitments to the Pacific. And we hope that more, and we've engaged earlier today at the Hill to try and find more engagement and more meaningful engagement between our regions, also with the US as well as the Quad members. And so I in terms of deliverables at this moment, it's not clear. But in terms of what your follow-up question was, concessional financing, so Nauru actually is not eligible to concessional financing in the World Bank scheme of things, and we're actually slated for graduation of in the OECD DAC things to be a higher income country, even though we've got COVID, we've got vulnerability to the climate. So in terms of the system not recognizing our vulnerability, the GDP, the GNI, the current measurement metrics that is used, this is where that MVI discussion is very important for us in the longer stream of things. And we do hope that our partners, as you said, rightfully, the Quad members who are members of this board, listen to us and understand that we come in a region that is now vulnerable on a lived climate reality. And some of these we cannot express nor adapt as much as we could before. So these are the things that needs to take in. It's like a whole encompassing thing for the island. It's not like one-on-one. We need foreign and development investments. We need this. It's all encompassing because we're such small entities and we're so far away from the market. So I hope that answers in that nutshell. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm told we are about a minute out, but I'll invite all the ambassadors to probably perhaps offer your final or concluding remarks and touch on any of the questions that was brought up. Maybe start with you.
No, just to say that, the Pacific countries are large ocean states, and one of the issues that perhaps we need to have more discussion and conversation on is the ocean, the health of the ocean, for example. And one of the immediate concern that we have is plastic pollution. Just like fish, they migrate and they end up in the Pacific Islands. And I think we need to do something about it, because predictions are that by 2050, at the current trend, you will have more plastic in the ocean than fish. And I think that would be really something in the context of Pacific Island countries who depend on fish. It's one of the resources that we have at our disposal. So plastic pollution, and the UN is doing something about that at the moment. Thank you.
Ambassador Tony.
Thank you. Perhaps the last comment for myself is I want to highlight linkages, because I see the world as something that it's alive, it grows. We see that in business organizations, they break up, they merge, depending on the situation at hand. Referring to the question that was just asked about the Quad, I see our engagement here in Washington, D.C., the issue that we're discussing is security and climate change. But we are under the framework of a discussion with the U.S. with regards to many things, including our priorities at the Pacific. With the Quad, the basic document is the Indo-Pacific strategy. I just mentioned a number of key strategic documents in the Pacific. The 2050 strategy I mentioned, there is the other declaration, the PIF communiques and so forth. We need to link these And what's a new situation that we have in the Pacific region? It's the geopolitics of the Pacific region. We need to link, we need to align. If we've been doing something in the old way and there are new, for example, climate change is a new threat. We need to reinvent, we need to innovate. That's how businesses grow. I think in the government, that's how constitutions, societies grow. They reform their constitution. There is technologies. We are living in the digital age. We need to capitalize education, bring it to that area, digitalization. You don't grow if you can't link these and capitalize on these strengths and opportunities. Thank you.
I think with the conversation that we had in terms of the subject for discussion, I think it boils down to the goal that all of us have made commitment to in terms of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And without the collaboration and the partnership with all of us, that would remain a challenge for us to achieve that. And perhaps working in partnership with all the stakeholders, including the private sector and the NGO as well, with the government, is very critical to achieving that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ambassadors, for your very frank and honest conversations and perspectives that you've shared with us. I'm sure the audience here would agree that this was a really new perspective in terms of the climate conversation that we usually hear around Washington, and a great insight into how Pacific nations are thinking about the same issues that I think we do in our work and conversations on a day-to-day basis. So please join me in thanking this distinguished panel of ambassadors here today with us. Thank you, ambassadors, for your time, and more so for your honest sharing of your views and perspectives. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you.